Hey guys, welcome to Raw Customs. I'm your host, Patrick Rapolo, and on this episode, I thought I'd share with you how I built my homemade camera jib, guys. Now, I did build this a few years ago and lost some of the footage, but I ended up finding some of the footage, so I figured I'd put together what I had for you guys and give you guys some ideas of what it'd take to build something like this yourself. Now, this is a scrap build, guys, made from whatever I had laying around the shop. As far as the rods themselves or the extenders, these are made from one of those tents that you usually see at conventions and stuff. It just has the tent top and these legs actually extend out, so these work out great because now I have a telescoping camera jib and I can go from around 4 or 5 feet here up close to around 9 feet of height from the ground down, so this works out great. For me, I use this all the time. This is one of the best tools that I have in my shop, guys, for filming. Every kit that you see me film, guys, I am using this. This actually allows me to actually put the camera on the end and face it down to the build itself. And I usually have this facing in this direction up here, guys, with my camera up here. And I'm able to reach up and do quick adjustments while I'm doing the builds. And since I bought a new camera, I'll actually reach up and adjust the focus by hand, or not the focus, but the zoom by hand. So this has been a real good addition to my build. Now, one of the things I really like about this when I'm doing the tutorials, guys, is this actually stands on its own and is not touching the table. So while I'm working, if I jar the table or anything, I'm not getting a vibration in the camera. Just one of the things that I can use it for, something you might be interested in using it for yourself. Now, since I've got this, guys, I have made a few changes. When I first built it, I actually bought a cheap tripod, cut the end off for the camera mount. Since then, I've upgraded my camera equipment, so I needed something a little more solid, so I went ahead and bought this ball mount, which is very strong and it holds my camera just fine. Now, there are a couple of drawbacks to this particular one. Number one, it's heavy. It's not easy to take from one place to another. Number two, one thing I would change if I was going to build another one is use something better for the swivel down here. This is part of a caster, so I do have a little bit of wiggle in the head, which hasn't been a major problem, but every once in a while a jar on the floor can actually wiggle the camera. It's just something I keep in mind while I'm filming. Well, alright guys, if you're interested in doing something like this yourself, check out the video. This is how I did it. I started this build with a pop-up canopy that was damaged and about to be thrown away. I took it apart and removed 2 of the legs. Since they telescope, I figured they'd work good for the jib arms. I found some C-channel that came off of an old table. Then I measured out and marked 8 inches at each end to make 2 pieces. I used a hand bandsaw with a metal cutting blade to make the 2 cuts. Next, I laid out my 2 pieces of channel on each side of one of the arms. And then I lined up the extra channel along the bottom of all 3 pieces. I lined up one edge flush and marked the other side to get the width. Then I marked a straight edge and cut that section off. On my 2 pieces of channel that will hold the arms, I measured across the width and found center, and then marked a reference line down the center. I measured down from the top and marked it at 2 and 6 inches. Then I moved over to the drill press and drilled a hole at each of my cross marks. The next step was to line up the side with the bottom piece. I used some 90-degree welding magnets to hold everything in place, and then all 3 pieces welded together. On the arms, I measured down 6 inches from the back end and drilled a hole at the center on the side walls. To allow the neck to swivel, I took the wheel out of a caster and used the main body. To fill the gap where the wheel was, I used some 2-inch square tubing. I drilled 2 holes through the tubing and slid some bolts through to hold the tubing in place. Then I lined up the next section on top of the tubing, marked and welded the 2 pieces together, and then cleaned the welds with a grinder. To make the camera mount section for the front of the jib, I used 2-inch square tubing. I measured down 5 inches and then made a mark. Then I used the bandsaw to cut off one side of the tubing and cut it off square at my 5-inch mark. This basically gave me a piece of C-channel for the front of the jib. Next I marked and drilled out the holes through both sides of the front piece. They were set at 4 inches apart from each other to match the holes in the neck. Next I used some angle iron and made a triangle base to make a tripod. I welded on casters at each corner and used some square tubing and some pipe to make the tripod. Sorry I don't have all the video for this part of the build. Next I took a stationary caster and removed the wheel. I used a grinder with a Metabo blade to cut the weld and remove the top mount. The mount was lined up and centered on the tripod and then welded in place. With the top plate welded on, I set the neck section on top and bolted the 2 sections together. To make a platform for the camera mount, I used the remaining portion of the caster and cut off one side and welded it to the front C-channel of the jib. For the camera mount, I bought a cheap tripod. I cut off the mount section and drilled a hole through the center of it. I ran a bolt through the center of the mount and through the hole in the platform to hold the 2 pieces together. For the back arm, I used another piece of tubing from the canopy. I lined it up with the top arm and made a mark for the pop pin, and then drilled a hole to allow the pop pin to lock in place. This makes the back arm removable. To make a counterbalance, I used some thick wall square tubing and some metal pop collars that I had laying around. I laid the collar on the side of the tubing and marked references where the holes were. Then I lined up bolts on the marks and welded them in place. On the bottom I drilled a hole and welded on a nut to run a bolt through so I could lock the slide in place on the rear arm. Once all my sections were fabricated, everything was cleaned up and given a coat of black paint. I did end up welding the neck section to the rotating caster. I started the assembly by mounting the neck to the tripod. I happened to have a TV mount laying around and thought it might just be a good idea to have a monitor on the jib. I was able to notch the bottom hole of the mount and mount it to the side of the neck using the bolts for the arms. To keep the jib from squeaking when I move the arms up and down, I use nylon washers. I put the washers in between the arm and the inside of the neck on both sides. I lined up the holes with the arms, the washers, and the neck piece and ran bolts all the way through. Once both of the bolts were ran through, I set the swivel arm for the monitor in place and used nylon locking nuts to hold everything in place. I tightened the bolts down snug and made sure there was just a little bit of friction on the arms when they moved up and down. Next, I slid the front arms inside the back arms and bolted the front section in place. The C-channel on the front piece was a little bit wider than the front arm itself, so to fill the gap, I just added nylon washers until the arm fit tightly inside the channel. Once the bolts were pushed through, I used nylon locking nuts on the ends and then tightened everything down snug. Next, the rear arm was locked in place and the slide and counterweights put on. With the arm slid in, I have about a 7 to 8 foot rise And once the arms are extended out, I have somewhere around 10 to 11 feet of height. Once the counterbalance is set, you can move the jib and it will hold its position where you leave it. So I did end up having an old TV laying around, so I mounted it to the jib to use for a monitor. And since it's mounted to the neck, it will move with the spin of the jib. And here's the few shots I made using the camera jib. I hope this video gives you guys some ideas and helps you out. Thanks for watching, guys.